Today we will discuss the simple analytic technique of flowcharting and how this technique may be applied. Within this tutorial, we will review the following. First, we will discuss the definition of the technique. Next, we will review the appropriate use, followed by the added value of flowcharting. Then, we will discuss the potential pitfalls associated. Lastly, we will examine the phases of flowcharting and then illustrate the process with an example. This tutorial has been designed to help foster a better understanding of the analytic technique of flowcharting. We will start by defining the technique. Flowcharting is a tool that labels each step of a process in order to show the logical relationship between each event or activity. Flowcharting has been in use since 1921 and has served the initial purpose of representing electronic data processing. Now, flowcharting has come to represent the logic of a process in business settings in addition to other industries. Regardless of the purpose for use, a flowchart is a valuable tool comprised of symbols that users should familiarize themselves with, no matter what the task may be. The beginning steps, intermediate steps, and final steps should all be clearly labeled in addition to the use of arrows to show the process and the connection of each of the steps to one another. A flowchart will fall into one of two categories and will be considered either a high-level or detailed type. A high-level chart will show the major steps of the process that will give the viewer the basic picture, which is most useful in the case of identifying participants. A detailed chart will contain all steps, not just the major steps that are present within the process. This type of chart is most useful in identifying problem areas due to the existence of decision points and feedback loops represented within the chart. Decision points are those that occur when the chart comes to a yes/no or true/false response, which will cause a point to branch off in different directions. Feedback loops are those that occur when the output resulting from an event will influence the future output of the same event. Flowcharting is a technique that should be used in order to meet 4 objectives. The first objective is to understand the complete process. The second objective is to identify the critical stages of a process. The third objective is to locate problem areas associated. And the fourth and final objective is to show the various relationships between the different steps of a process. The flowcharting technique adds value to analysis in a variety of ways. One way that flowcharting adds value is by helping the viewer to understand the process and improve upon its deficiencies. Additionally, flowcharting also provides a clear way for individuals that are new to the process to comprehend it in an easier manner. Thus, flowcharting can be effective in training employees that may not have a great understanding by improving upon their understanding. Potential pitfalls that may be associated with the process of flowcharting could arise in a few different ways. First, if the user creates a flowchart for the ideal process rather than the actual process, it will be an incorrect illustration. Secondly, the user may choose to withhold problems in order to prevent being called upon to explain why these problems exist, which is not a thorough representation of the problem because the flowchart would only be comprised of the positive attributes of the process. Thirdly, if the user only possesses limited knowledge of the process, the flowchart will not reach its maximum potential. The flowcharting methodology, comprised of 4 phases, is as follows. First, the process must be identified. Second, the process must be described. Third, it is important to search for opportunities that could improve the process. And the fourth and final phase is to update the flowchart based on the 3 previously stated steps. Phase 1, identifying the process, is where the user will define both the start point and the finish point for the process under examination, and will then label them accordingly. In Phase 2, where the objective is to describe the process, the whole process should be charted from beginning to end by noting each successive activity or event. There are several tips for this phase that may make the process easier for the user. The first tip suggests that the user will first note the major steps of the process and will then add the corresponding substeps. The second tip calls for the division of the flowchart into columns. By doing so, the user will be able to identify when different departments are responsible for each step in the process. The third tip suggests 3 questions for the user to ask when figuring out the steps of events, and they are as follows. First question, who provides the input for the step, and who uses it? Second question, what is done with the input, and what decisions are made while the input is being used? Third question, what is the output to this step, and who uses it to do what? In the third phase, the user will search for improvement opportunities through a three-parted process. Part 1, the user must identify all areas that either hinder the process or are obsolete. In Part 2, if the user has identified the most efficient layout in Part 1, then they must now note the differences between the current and ideal process. In Part 3, the user must question why these differences exist in order to determine how to rectify the problem areas. Phase 4 simply calls for the user to update the flowchart. The user will do so by building a new and improved flowchart that corrects the identified problems of the process. Now, in order to illustrate what the end result of a flowchart should look like, we will reference an example. The following example provides a flowchart that describes a typical risk assessment process. The risk assessment process begins with stating the objective and concludes with communication of the risk. The intermediate steps, some being interrelated, are labeled clearly within the body of the chart. As with any other analytic technique, there are several cautions of use when constructing a flowchart. First, the user should begin by creating a high-level chart in order to ensure that all of the necessary steps are properly labeled. Once this is done, the addition of greater detail in later steps could be completed more easily. Also, creating a flowchart should be done as a team in order to build a common understanding and to bring together several sources of knowledge. Additionally, the chart should reflect what really happens within the process, not the ideal, even if this means that reasoning would then be required. The creation of a flowchart may now be completed in an efficient and thorough manner. Feel free to reference both the article and the tutorial in the future if necessary.